Hey up there, campers. Welcome back. Johnny Matthew here. If this is your first time on the blog, it is great to have you here. This is the blog pod, so it's the voiceover for the regular, normally weekly-ish blog post that appears on Substack, johnnyvm.substack.com. If you're new here, welcome. It's great to have you. If you've been coming for a while and you're enjoying the material, you might want to consider becoming a paid subscriber. I would be very grateful, and you can do it for about £5, I think. Think of it as the price of a pint, and that'd be marvellous. So this is the first voiceover blog I've done for a long time. Thank you for your patience in waiting for these. It was a very long and tricky year, being with and helping my lovely mum during the end-of-life phase of her care. But it is good to be back into this, and I'm certainly finding the routine useful. So we're back at it. I'm going to do a couple more blogs to continue a series that we started, I think, early 2025 called Theory Bites. And these are kind of bite-sized, blog-sized, looks at the key theories, really, which might be useful to us in our work with troubled kids. So this is number 6. I've split this into 2, one looking at the theory and then one looking a little bit more at the application of the theory. So here we go. This is Theory Bites 6A, Lawrence Kohlberg, Theory of Moral Development. Introduction. Why do kids do what they do? What drives their sense of right and wrong? Can you teach this stuff, or is it imbibed by just being in the world? What role does education have in moral development of children? Before, during and after the turn of the 20th century, these were some of the big questions that were exercising thinkers at the time, really. Thinkers in psychology, sociology, and philosophy. So Lawrence Kohlberg kind of sits, I guess, at the end of a little line of thinkers, particularly Jean Piaget and Emile Durkheim. So really Kohlberg, building on Piaget's work, revolutionised contemporary understanding of how children and adults develop moral reasoning. He proposed that moral development happens in 6 distinct stages, and that these can be grouped into 3 levels. So think of it as 6 stages in groups of 2, 3 groups of 2. And the stages progress, as with all the other theories, as individuals mature, as they encounter real-life moral dilemmas, and then develop their thinking around that. Now, for professionals working with children, especially those recovering from developmental trauma and or those who offend, understanding Kohlberg's theory can help us, I think. It can help us to think more clearly and guide more effective interventions and foster a healthier morality in the kids that we're trying to serve. But before we get into that, let's back up a little bit first. Context. Simply and very generally put, as always with me, you guys know that by now, Lawrence Kohlberg did the hard work of theorising required to progress the thinking of Emile Durkheim and Jean Piaget, as we've said. So right at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Durkheim's emphasis was on the moral impact of society on the developing child. So the child growing up in society, if you like, internalises its norms and expectations such that the society becomes represented in the child. Durkheim was interested in the role of education in explaining the morality of society and thereby, through education, and reinforcing it. Now, critics, including Lawrence Kohlberg, felt that this approach was too pedagogical or a bit too teachy, really. Writing a little bit later on, Jean Piaget included the child developing morality in his staged theory of cognitive development. I'm going to do a post or two on this a little bit later in the series. Now, Piaget emphasised the need for children to discover morality for themselves rather than being taught it, which he thought robbed the child of fully understanding it, really. So Durkheim, bit of a fan of education and the role of schools and so forth in that process. Piaget, less of a fan. Then comes into the fray Lawrence Kohlberg. Now, he published his doctoral thesis in 1958, I think it was, with a focus on thinking. Very, very much a cognitive theory, even though it's looking at morality and education. It's very cognitively driven. I think that's one of the conclusions I've come to in this. And of course, some of the criticisms of it come from the angle that it's too cognitive. Anyway, Kohlberg asked a big group of adolescents for their views on various moral dilemmas. Now, the classic one that you might have come across before is this, quote, should Heinz, that's a person, not a tin of beans, should Heinz steal a drug to save the life of his wife, or should he obey the law and let his wife die for lack of the drug? Why or why not? Unquote. So he asked these kids, these teenagers, for their responses to this question, and then he followed the same group over the next 20 years, continued to test them as he went along, and observed the development of their moral reasoning. Kohlberg said that this development changed in quite a predictable way that progressed with age, increasing in complexity and scope over time. And what his eventual theory, which I think was 71-ish when the kind of main thing landed, is his articulation of this progression and maturing to increasingly complex and autonomous moral thinking. Principles of Kohlberg's theory. So before looking at the developmental stages themselves, there are some broad principles that will help us to understand it and its structure and children's progression through it. So there's 6 of these, so I'll just whiz through these. These are useful prerequisites to have in mind. Number 1, sequential progression. Now, this is the case with pretty well all the theories we've looked at. But Kohlberg held that moral reasoning develops in a fixed order. And we talk about things like developmental milestones, don't we? So it's similar to that. And that individuals can't skip stages. In other words, you have to achieve a certain amount of one stage before you can begin progress on the next stage. Now, Abraham Maslow, writing about this, called this idea prepotency. You have to have something achieved of the previous stage before you can move on to the next one. So, principle number 1, sequential progression. Number 2, cognitive development link. Advanced moral reasoning relies on cognitive growth. This is Kohlberg's view, now remember. So the more mature the cognition, the more advanced the moral reasoning. Really important that, particularly if we're working with troubled kids, and we'll talk more about this next time when we look at the application. So sequential progression, number 1. Number 2, there's a cognitive development link. Number 3, universal stages. These stages, Kohlberg held, were universal across cultures. And though the pace of progression varies, of course, as does what constitutes moral, immoral, or amoral, as always. There's some societal elements to that, philosophical elements, and of course, religious elements too. So that's number 3, universal stages. Number 4, focus on reasoning over action. Moral development, certainly according to Kohlberg, emphasizes the reasoning behind actions. It's not just the behaviors or the decisions themselves. It's the process of reasoning that sits behind it. Number 5, I've called this discombobulation drives growth. We could say that, dilemmas or moral challenges drive growth. In other words, encountering and grappling with challenging moral situations and dilemmas promotes movement to higher reasoning. As we use that reasoning to confront and find our way through increasingly complex moral situations, that develops the thinking itself. And then number 6, perspective taking. The ability to see situations from others' viewpoints is essential for advancing through the stages. And there is an argument, I think, that the whole articulation of Kohlberg's theory is a slow progression of increasing kind of empathy and theory of mind mentalization, I guess. Now, obviously, that requires metacognition, thinking about thinking, and other executive functions like empathy and so on, as we mentioned above. So we've got, number one, sequential progression. Number two, there's a cognitive development link. Number three, universal stages. Number four, a focus on reasoning over action. Number five, that discombobulation drives growth. If we're unsettled by something, it forces us to think and grow. And number six, perspective taking. Right. I'm going to take a 2-second breather while I have a quick slurp so that I'm not too dry talking to you, and then we'll come back. All right, here we go. The 6 stages of moral development. As with all the theories we've looked at, this one is broad and zoomed out. It can't, of course, be applied rigorously and specifically to an individual child and be expected to nail it every time, faultlessly explaining what's going on. It is kind of zoomed out and general, but it does provide, I think, a useful framework. And it can give us a useful overall view of human development as it deals with issues of morality, conscience, if you like, certainly in the later stages, and ethical thinking. And like most theories, it can help structure our thinking and save us from lazy tropes and unhelpful practice habits. So here goes, a quick overview of Kohlberg's moral stages of moral development or justice reasoning. Now remember, it's 6 stages and there are 3 levels. So I'll give you the level first. I'll tell you what stages are in that level, and then I'll give you a couple of quick bullet point observations. So this is the pre-conventional level, typically early childhood, number 1. And stage number 1 is obedience and punishment orientation, and stage number 2, self-interest orientation. So pre-conventional level. In this stage, children make choices that respond to labels or rules of right and wrong, good or bad. But these are interpreted in terms of the pros and cons for them and or the power of those making the rules. So stage 1, obedience and punishment orientation. So this is basically decisions are made not because in themselves they're right or wrong, but because we want to avoid getting in trouble. In a child's sense, I suppose, to avoid being punished or sanctioned by a parent. So rules are viewed in this stage as quite fixed and unchangeable. They're not seen in context. You either do them or you don't, and the tendency to do them is based not on the thing itself or its moral rectitude, but on not wanting to get in bother. So, for example, a child doesn't take the chocolate biscuits without asking because they're frightened they'll get told off if they do. Okay? So stage number 1, obedience and punishment orientation. Stage number 2, self-interest orientation. So actions in this stage are driven by self-interest and immediate benefits. So there's a progression there slightly. It's not just about not getting into trouble anymore. There's this might be actually good for me. Now, an awareness in this stage also emerges that others have interests and they might benefit too if we make the right choice. But actually, we're still not that bothered about that. We are still, really, it's about us. If others benefit, well, hey-ho. But actually, we're aware of that, but it's not much more than that. It's basically, what are the benefits for me? And it's about self-interest. So, for example, a child helps to tidy her room because mum has promised her a treat if she does. Okay. So, again, it's not about tidying the room, but actually, I get a tidy room and I get a treat as well. So it's really not about the room, it's what I get. So these are the 2 stages in the pre-conventional level. This is kind of typically early childhood stuff. Obedience and punishment orientation. We obey to avoid punishment. And then stage 2, self-interest orientation. Actually, it might be worth obeying, not just to avoid the punishment, but because I get something else from it. Okay, that's level 1. Level 2. Conventional level, typically adolescence. So in the conventional level, there's 2 stages. So stage 3 is interpersonal accord and conformity. And stage 4, authority and maintenance of social order. Okay, so conventional level, typically adolescence. The child understands in this level, and they want to behave in ways that maintain the expectations of the group. So that could be family, society, country, to which they belong, and not merely out of an expected imperative to conform, but there's now a personal desire to do so as well. I'm not doing it just because I have to. I'm doing it because actually there's a bit of me that wants to. I'm a part of this, if you like. So the breakdown of that, stage 3, interpersonal accord and conformity, and stage 4, authority and maintenance of social orientation. So stage 3, interpersonal accord and conformity, there's a focus here on being a, quote, good person, unquote, and meeting societal expectations. So this is a kind of extension beyond the stage 2 of purely self-interest orientation and a kind of tacit sense that, well, other people might benefit, I do the right thing, but it's still mainly about me. In stage 3 now, it's actually, I'm quite invested in this idea that people think I'm okay if I do this. And therefore, I'm quite happy to meet this social or societal expectation. And so the child then begins to, their moral reasoning, their thinking, tends to prioritize that stuff. Is a little bit about fitting in here. There's a bit about prioritizing relationships with other people and gaining social approval. So an example of this interpersonal accord and conformity might be that a kid takes on, say, a sponsored run. All right, they're not particularly into running, but actually they take on a sponsored run because his friends will be quite impressed, because a couple of them are involved. It seems to be being seen as a bit cool, so maybe I'll go with that. So there's this sense of, I want to be a good person. I'm slightly invested in this, but actually it's also about the relationships of other people and what they think of me, and I quite like it when they approve of me. That's the stage 3 stuff. And then stage 4, in the conventional level, is authority and maintenance of social order. So in this now, there's a sense, there's an emphasis on law and order, really, but not just the black and white concrete law and order per se, but also that I, as a member of this group that has these laws and expectations, I've got a duty on me to uphold those societal rules, if you like. So again, it's beyond that kind of immediate situation. I want people to kind of think well of me and approve, and I want my relationships to work, and I quite like being a bit cool. This is a bit more than that. This is actually, we're a part of a bigger thing here, and these rules exist for a bit of a reason, and obeying these rules is justified because it kind of maintains the functioning of the bigger group and serving the greater good, if you like. So for this one, it might be a young driver doesn't park on double yellow lines, even though it would be much more convenient. But they don't do it because, well, not particularly now. They might get a fine or a ticket, or, you know, somebody puts a big one of these locks on their car wheels and they can't get out. Although that would be very annoying. But with this one, it's that actually I'm not going to park in these double yellow lines, because if I did, what if an ambulance needs to come through, or a fire engine or something, or, you know, I cause an accident. So there's a sense that, yeah, the laws exist for a reason. I'm kind of into that. Whether I look good, that's nice if I look good, but it's not the main thing anymore. I've moved beyond that. I've progressed up to stage 4 now. It's more about upholding these rules that society's put in place. And you know what? In doing that, I'm serving the greater good. So that is a conventional level, typically in adolescence and emerging adulthood. Stage 3, interpersonal accord and conformity. And stage 4, in the conventional level, authority and maintenance of social order. So that brings us to the last level, level 3, with stages 5 and 6 in it. So the post-conventional level, this is called, and it's achieved by some adults, if at all. So this is the kind of high expectation. And there's 2 stages, as with the others, in the post-conventional level. Stage 5 is social contract orientation. And stage 6, universal ethical principles. So post-conventional level in general first. The individual makes a clear effort to define and conform to principles that are valid aside from the group and aside from the individual's own identification with the group. In other words, I'm not doing it just because I'm in and I want to remain in, but I'm also not doing it just because I'm here as a member of this group or a citizen of this country or this community, if you like, and therefore I have a responsibility. Now we're moving beyond that. It's an effort to define, to define, understand, and conform to bigger principles than those things. So stage 5, social contract orientation. So in stage 5, an awareness here that rules and laws exist to serve society, but this is the first time we've seen a but here. But they can and actually need to be changed if those rules and laws are unjust or they need updating. For example, perhaps, common practice changes or thinking moves on and so forth. So yes, those rules and laws exist to serve us all as a group, but you know what? We may need to change those. And so we're kind of aware of that. The social contract isn't fixed and concrete, but it can evolve over time. And then stage 6. So an example of stage 5, forgive me, is, let's say there's a protest and someone decides to risk arrest at that illegal protest because it's a demonstration against human rights violations that serves a much higher cause. So in stage, in the pre-conventional level, stage 1, well, I wouldn't do it because I wouldn't want to get punished. And I might do it in the conventional level, it's kind of level 2. I might do it because, well, I'm a decent person. I don't really want to get arrested, and I'd rather look good than be seen by others as somebody who's getting into trouble. But at the third post-conventional level, it's more than that. It's, well, people might not agree with me, and I may get into trouble, but you know what? There's something bigger at stake here. That we as a society need to make decisions and laws based on fairness and human rights. So, do you know what? It may be a banned protest, but I'm going to go because there's a higher cause. That would be one example. And then stage 6 pushes it even further again. And this is called universal ethical orientation or principles. So this is guided by much more abstract moral principles. So not just expectations of other people, expectations of the group, laws and rules that are kind of agreed in common with the group, or maybe just what I feel. It's now much bigger again. It's big moral, kind of abstract moral principles like justice, equality, dignity. So laws in this stage become secondary to these big overarching principles, and they exist to serve those principles. And again, in stage 5, we might need to look at changing laws actually, because they're out of date now. And a classic example would be the old kind of Victorian, early 20th century laws around the illegality of homosexual relationships. I mean, very few people now would put their hand up in public and say, I think they should be illegal, because thinking has completely moved on. Society's better for it, but there would have been a crucial stage where the big players and the big voices would have been stage 6 players saying, listen, there's a bigger principle here than the law. The law can be an ass, and we need to sometimes give it a kick and change it. So the idea in this stage is that moral choices are based on moral principles. And sometimes the principles may cause a person to make choices in service to those principles that supersede all the existing convention and laws. Now, I've had to kind of think through what this might mean for an example, but where I've come to is I think it's really, examples would be the kind of selfless, principled actions of people like Rosa Parks. in the civil rights movement in the southern states of America. She refused to give up her seat on the bus because a white person had got on and she was black and the white person needs to be preferred. That was the expectation. And she just says, no, I'm not doing it. And there's a massive kerfuffle. The civil rights movement, of course, takes on that case, uses it for brilliant sort of positive propaganda and publicity. And now we've all heard of Rosa Parks. Alexei Navalny might be another one. So he's challenging, or was challenging, systemic corruption in Putin's Russia and standing as a potential alternative candidate. Well, of course, he suffered all kinds of problems, was eventually arrested and died in custody. So it cost him everything. But in service of the universal ethical kind of moral principles that he and the vast majority of free people in the world think are important, that was, in his mind, a risk worth taking. Or somebody like Harriet Tubman, who again smuggled hundreds of slaves to freedom via the Underground Railroad, smuggling slaves from the southern states of America across the lines to the north. So these people, Rosa Parks, Alexei Navalny, Harriet Tubman, might be examples of this stage. So it's worth noting here, I think, as I mentioned it earlier, and it does remain a bit of a mystery to me, to be honest, that although Kohlberg thought that stages 1 to 4 are universal, that's, so they obey not to get punished, obey because it serves me. Okay, I'm interested in other people at stage 3. At stage 4, I'm interested in kind of, okay, there's a social order we all get as a group here that's worth it. So that's stages 1 to 4. They're universal, he's saying, to all people, and it crosses cultures and societies, at least in general terms. But he felt that adults rarely achieve moral development to stages 5 and 6. And he's talking about individuals here, of course. And he felt that only around about 10%, maybe 15% of people reach these stages, 5 and 6, this post-conventional level. And I guess it's in the name, isn't it? The conventional is the middle bit where we kind of, we want to be good people, we want to look good, and we want to maintain some social order. But now we're at the post-conventional level, moving on again and saying, well, actually it's bigger than that, and it's bigger than us, and it's bigger than these laws. There's something greater at stake. And he's saying maybe 10, 15% of people will get to this stage. And there has been some recent research, and there's some links in the text post on Substack. And that research suggested about 20% of people reach the post-conventional level at stage 5 or 6. But whatever the truth of it, it's unlikely that any of us will know whether or not we'll attain level 6, for example, the kind of Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Alexei Navalny stage, until our personal circumstances confront us with the kinds of stark choices, the like of which these people encountered. And I guess a modern example of this might be the people who suffered significantly at the hands of the ICE service, the immigration, whatever it is, enforcement service in the States. I mean, there's been 2 people killed ridiculously and without reason in recent weeks. And now people are out on the streets. Now, I think those are your stage 5 and 6 people. Those are the people who are saying, listen, this may cost me here, but there's something bigger at stake. So it's really powerful stuff. And I guess we won't know until something happens in our lives or our part of society that forces us to say, are we prepared to put up with this? Or am I going to put everything on the line to make this shift? So those are the stages. Pre-conventional level, that's stage 1, obedience and punishment orientation. Stage 2, self-interest orientation. The second, conventional level, adolescence. Stage 3 in there, interpersonal accord and conformity. Stage 4, authority, maintenance of social order. And then the post-conventional level. Stage 5 in there is the social contract, and stage 6, universal ethical principles. So, final thoughts. There we go. That's the theory laid out in all its glory. Now, like the others that we've covered, Kohlberg is staged and sequential, and it assumes a degree, at least, of prepotency at each stage, that idea that you have to achieve one stage, at least in part, before you can move on to the next. But where does that leave us in our efforts to help the kids that we work with and care for? Good question. Well, in the next post, we'll look at this a bit more closely to see what Kohlberg has to offer us in our work. And in the meantime, I think, though, that knowing a little bit about how children might develop this side of their functioning is useful. And I say might develop because, of course, it's a theory of moral development. It can help structure our thinking, but I think that's good enough. I think because each child is different, each family's circumstance is different, each set of relationships is different, the ecosystem around the child is different. Thinking back to our previous post on Yuri Bronfenbrenner stuff there. But it can help sort of structure our thinking about how kids might develop. Not least because it helps to shape and bring form to how we see an area of their lives that can easily add to their woes. We all deal with kids from really troubled backgrounds whose current behaviour and presentation and subjective experience is really, really difficult. But these kids then, for example, go on to find themselves on the wrong side of the law. Now, I think having a kind of moral structure, theoretical moral structure that we can think about can be useful as we think about how we can respond in ways that take account of their relative maturity and their previous experience when it comes to ethics, other awareness, and morality in general. So more on that next week. There we go. I hope that is useful, guys, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next one for a bit of application. Cheers.